Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dennis Prager Show. I have in studio, I didn't even expect this. I thought I would be talking to him and he would be in Jerusalem. But he is on a book tour in the United States, and that's excellent because I always like having an author in studio. And this is probably, I would say, one of the 5 most important books written about the Middle East and the United States ever written, and certainly the most important of the contemporary era. It is written by the former ambassador of Israel to the United States, Michael Oren, and it is titled Ally. It's a good title, Ally. My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. The tension between the United States and Israel is the greatest that I have witnessed in my lifetime, and the ambassador of Israel to the United States, who has seen and experienced this tension, is with me, and he has written about this very openly and about the American-Israeli relationship. I am a big believer that George Gilder is right in the Israel test, that it is the way of assessing a person's moral compass. Could you play, I'd like to play the very first moments of George Gilder on the Israel test, a book that he wrote. George Gilder, for your information, is not Jewish, because it shouldn't have to be said, but it's probably relevant. And he says it at the end. It's a Prager University course, and it's based on his terrific book, The Israel Test. I am a big believer in this very notion, which I recently discussed. Here is George Gilder at the opening of his course at Prager University.
How do you respond to people who excel you in invention, creativity, and wealth? Do you envy them? Do you feel their success somehow diminishes you? Or do you admire what they've achieved and try to emulate it?
That's it. That's it. Those are the questions. These are the determinative issues, and that is, I am convinced, a major part of the reason for Israel hatred, and for that matter, Jew hatred and American hatred. Anyway, this extremely thoughtful man, because he's a historian prior to being a diplomat, Michael Oren. Michael Oren, welcome to the Dennis Prager Show.
Dennis, I can't believe I'm actually in your studio. We have talked so many times in the past.
Right.
Usually I've been a soldier in Lebanon or a soldier in Gaza. Someone's usually shooting at me when I'm talking to you. And here I am sitting in your studio. Nobody's shooting at me. This is wonderful.
Well, knock wood.
It's early in the day.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, you never know what'll happen. Right. Well, you have written here, I have started it, I am going to finish every word of it, and I don't say that all the time, as my listeners know. It's not possible. I can't read every book of every author I have on, although there are many important books, and I wish I could. I wish we could implant books into our brain.
Lovely.
They would be lovely. All right, so I ask every author, virtually every author who's written something significant, I open with the same question. Why did you write the book?
Well, that is a huge question. It's a question I asked myself even while I was writing the book. Keep in mind, as you said, I had been an historian. I had never written a book in the first person before. Never said, I thought this, I did this. So that was a huge transformation for me and a big challenge. Then the next challenge is I'm writing about an intimate relationship and conversations between officials. And how do you begin to approach that question? Fortunately, I had some help. I had this book was reviewed by no less than 7 Israeli agencies, twice by the Israel Defense Forces, twice by the Defense Ministry, and once by the Mossad, in addition to other agencies. So I had some help with what I could say and what I couldn't say. I could say, as it turned out, an awful lot. They took out very little, Dennis, you should know. And then I had to make a case. I had to make a case that the U.S.-Israel alliance is vital not just for the United States and Israel. It's vital for what remains of Middle East stability. It is crucial for the world because the whole world looks at this relationship as a litmus of America's dependability, of Israel's strength, and it has ramifications that are global.
Yeah, well, I agree with that entirely. Let's talk about the book. Let's talk about the Middle East right now. Do you believe that the Prime Minister of Israel made a terrible mistake? And I'm not leading you on. I have a position, but it is not necessarily what the question implies. But your Prime Minister has been terribly attacked, or greatly attacked, for saying during the election campaign that he can't see the establishment of a Palestinian state at this time. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that comment?
Well, in basic, I agree with it, by the way. I don't think anybody can see a Palestinian state at the time. For the record, President Obama said he can't see a Palestinian state at this time. Now keep in mind, look at where the Middle East is now. Syria, Iraq no longer exist. There isn't a Syria. There isn't an Iraq. If we were to create a Palestinian state tomorrow, it would have no national institutions. It would have no economy. It would have a corrupt, unelected leadership. People don't widely know in this country that last summer, during protective operation, Hamas tried to kill Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And they would have killed Mahmoud Abbas if not for the Israel Defense Forces. We saved him. And what if the Israel Defense Forces were to pull out of the West Bank and leave Mahmoud Abbas to his own devices? He wouldn't survive a week. And this Palestinian state, even if it were created, would fall to Hamas at best, ISIS at worst, very quickly. Now, should Israel always say that it's in favor of a two-state solution? I think we should, as a matter of diplomacy, even though there's nobody is going to negotiate with it now. Mahmoud Abbas is busy declaring a Palestinian state unilaterally in the UN and trying to declare us war criminals in the International Criminal Court. But we should say it. We should always be there. I believe we should be very careful where we build and where we do not build in the West Bank. Jerusalem is a different category. We can build wherever we want in Jerusalem. But so the Prime Minister didn't say he was against the two-state solution, to be fair to him. And by the way, I'm not in his party. I'm in government now. I'm not in his party. I'm not his spokesman anymore. But I will say, if you look at what he said, given the state of the Middle East today, it is really difficult to see a situation where we would have a two-state solution today.
Given that's what I felt. I didn't understand the attacks. They didn't seem to be morally or intellectually honest. At this time, with the Arab world in the chaos that it is in, why would anybody want to see a withdrawal of Israel from territory that is now stable? Wouldn't it be immediate instability and terror-based?
Yeah, there were terrible terrorist attacks around the Middle East this week. In Tunisia, now in Egypt. There's one little pocket of stability. It's Israel and the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And to have an Israeli military pullout right now is to create a vacuum that will fill up almost instantly with
I have
jihadist
to believe
forces.
Jordan would be frightened beyond words.
Jordan would probably implode.
Yeah.
It would be caught between Iraq, which doesn't exist anymore, ISIS on one side, and ISIS is now infiltrating Gaza at an enormous rate.
Yeah.
I'm in Knesset. I'm in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee.
I should have mentioned that, by the way. Ambassador Oren is now a member of the Israeli parliament, and he is not in the party of the Prime Minister of Israel.
So I am in the government. We are in the coalition,
right.
And as a member of the Defense Committee, we're regularly briefed. And we are tracking the degree to which ISIS has penetrated Gaza. How quickly would ISIS penetrate the West Bank if Israeli forces were not there?
Yes, exactly.
Instantaneously.
All right, let's get to the most sensitive question of all, and there'll be a break in the middle for reasons that keep the show alive, namely commercial breaks,
please,
which make talk radio possible. I always tell that to people who are somewhat tired of commercials. If it weren't for them, you would have national radio in the United States, and if you like that, there is one. It's called NPR. So I'd just like to periodically remind people, thank God for sponsors who make this possible. Anyway, the question is, there are many people who believe that the President of the United States is not a friend of Israel's. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, and I say repeatedly in the text that President Obama is not anti-Israel. He is in favor of a certain type of Israel. He himself has said that the Israel he admires was the pre-67 Israel, the Israel of Moshe Dayan. I think it's largely a mythic Israel. If you ask me, and I'll say this very emphatically, Israel today is much more open and much more democratic than it was before 1967. In many ways more liberal than it was before 1967. But that is the image that the president has and he admires, and he said this repeatedly, openly. We don't conform to that image today. And that is part of the problem, but there's a broader context, and that is the president came into the White House in 2009 with a worldview. And that world would have been a challenge for any Israeli government, not just the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a worldview that puts tremendous emphasis on cooperation with the UN, not a particularly friendly organization. Its outreach to the Muslim world, including some elements in the Muslim world who aren't too friendly to Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan.
All right, continue on the point when we come back, because I need to tell everybody about one of the most important books of the recent past. Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide, Michael Oren, O-R-E-N. Most recent ambassador of Israel to the United States, now a member of the Israeli parliament. The book is up at DennisPrager.com. We will return in a moment. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. I am speaking with the former ambassador of Israel to the United States and his major book, because it's honest. The book is titled Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. It's a little sad that you even have that subtitle, American-Israeli Divide, and I want to talk about that, obviously. But let's get back to President Obama. His worldview is the issue, not personal animosity. Is that a fair way of summarizing what you're saying?
I think you cannot say that the relationship between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu is the same relationship that, say, Bill Clinton had with Yitzhak Rabin or that George Bush had with Arik Sharon. It's not a love story, Dennis. But I don't think that's the whole of it. I think it starts with a worldview. I spent a lot of time studying that worldview. I gave myself a course that I called Obama 101. I took my skills as an historian and I applied them to trying to figure out who this person was. It was 2009 when he wasn't very well known. And I looked at everything he wrote, every speech he gave, and particularly his memoirs, which were, particularly his earliest memoirs, Dreams from My Father, which he wrote before he was thinking of running for president. So it's a rather candid glimpse into his soul. And I made several conclusions, not just about Israel, but the way the world looked through his eyes. And this was a person who, again, we said before the break, had a collegial approach to world affairs. America wasn't going to be the policeman anymore. A lot of cooperation with UN agencies, anti-colonialism, tremendous sympathy for the Palestinian cause, a desire to reach out and reconcile with Iran. It's there right from the beginning. And an interesting recoiling from military power. One of the most revealing lines the president ever said was spoken at a non-proliferation conference in 2010. I have this line emblazoned on my soul, and you'll know why. He said, "Whether we like it or not, the United States is the world's leading military superpower." Now think about what that line says. Would John Kennedy have spoken that line? Would Bill Clinton have spoken that line? Many people, particularly in my country, wake up and say a little prayer that the world's leading military power is also the world's leading democracy, because it wasn't always the case in history. Mm-hmm. But there is a reticence there. There's a reluctance, a recoiling from that status. Now that's for an Israeli ambassador, as controversial as this could be, this was my duty. I had to understand the challenges, some opportunities presented by this administration, and see to the degree to which Israel could or could not adapt.
I have said to my listeners for 6 years, because a lot of people think that the president is animated by all sorts of ideas or even by Islam. And I have said, folks, what explains Barack Obama politically, philosophically, is that he is a man of the left. Everything that you have just said corroborates my theory.
Whenever I had a question about where the administration was going, and this is, by the way, one of the most central, if not probably the most centralized administration in post-World War II American history, meaning that decisions are made pretty much within the Oval Office. Whenever I had a question where I didn't quite understand where the administration was going, I didn't go to the strategy. I always went to the ideology. Mm-hmm. And the ideology was a good guide.
Yes.
And I agree with you, Dennis.
Okay, good. Well, that's very well. I may have spoken over those words. I agree with you, Dennis. I just I want my listeners to the man who was at the vortex of American-Israeli relations. What years were you ambassador?
2009 to the end of 2013. Over 4.5 years.
Yes. All right. So the man at the vortex of that relationship agrees. That's the issue, folks. And people want to deny it. Both his defenders and his opponents want to deny that is the issue. It is not Barack Obama per se. It is the humanus leftus that is in the White House.
Israelis asked me, are things going to change in 2016? And there's obviously going to be a different president, but we're still going to be left with the left, as you said, which has a very important voice in this country, and in many cases is a growing voice in this country, and Israel has to acknowledge that. One of the problems we do face is that our leaders, many of them are American educated, but they were educated in a very different America. And one of the harder jobs I had as ambassador was to go back to Jerusalem and say, guys, the America you remember from the 70s and the 80s has changed an awful lot. And as much as Barack Obama is the architect of change, he is the product of the change.
Yes.
And it's also why I thought we would have an 8-term presidency under Barack Obama.
Well, you were right.
8-year president.
Yes, yeah, you were right. So, have you dealt with Hillary Clinton?
Extensively.
And any thoughts?
Formidable, very smart, physically strong. She would also go on seven nation tours and arrive in Jerusalem and negotiate for 10 hours straight. Strong, but keep in mind she is from a part of she's a member of the Democratic Party, and is a liberal. I think she's a self-described liberal. I'm not doing her a disservice by saying this. And should she win in 2016, that will have ramifications for Israeli policy, in which Israel will have to either adapt to or not adapt to, but understand non-adoption to that policy will have an outcome, will have a ramification.
I debated at the Oxford Forum last November, and my opponents, there were 2 against 2. My opponents were interestingly an Israeli expatriate, Avi Shleim, a professor.
I know quite well.
Well, that would be an interesting subject unto itself, but as interesting as it is, I won't veer there right now. And his partner was a PhD. She received her PhD under him, an Iranian-American woman from Berkeley. And she said, and this is on YouTube, you can see it, to hundreds of Oxford students present, she said, Israel treats the Palestinians the way the Nazis treated the Jews. And she got an ovation for that. How do you explain this spectacular lie getting an ovation at Oxford?
Well, before I explain it, let me say that when I go and speak at universities, and I as ambassador, I tried to get to at least 2 campuses every month, and I would usually choose those campuses that were the most hostile. There are 7,000 campuses in the United States. Sometimes you walk in as an Israeli, you get a standing ovation.
6,000 of them were tied for first among hostile to Israel.
I draw a red line. I'm willing to take almost every question from an audience, and some of them are quite crazy. The one question I am unwilling to answer is that question. The question is, Israel treats Palestinians the way the Nazis treated the Jews, and that sets me off because I don't see Israel lining up 6 million Palestinians and putting them in gas chambers. That to me is beyond the red line for me. Why did it get an ovation in England? Because students want to believe this. I think it hooks into some deep-seated historical animosity toward Jews, which is coming increasingly conflated with Zionism. I think that the Palestinian cause in Europe particularly, and in England especially, has gone beyond of all rationale. And I know that department very well, Avi Shleim's department. I've worked with it. And that is an idea that is widely accepted there. All
right. Michael Oren, O-R-E-N, the last ambassador of Israel to the United States, the most recent, I should say. The book is Ally, and it is up at the DennisPrager.com website. We continue. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. My guest is Michael Oren, the last ambassador of Israel. It's funny, whenever I say the last, in English it's a problem. Last is previous and end. God forbid end. Anyway, the previous ambassador during much of the Obama era, and he has written about this very honestly, and it's become a national bestseller immediately. Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. Let's talk about the subtitle because it's a painful one. Who would have imagined 15 years ago, let alone 30? I was a kid, and really kid. I was like 10. And I remember the way Israel was venerated in the United States. It was, Life magazine on the 13th anniversary of Israel had Israel's bar mitzvah. And during the 6-day war, people would get on and actually say "we" when referring to Israeli military movements. Mm-hmm. What's happened?
I actually have in my office in Washington at the embassy. I kept a copy of the Life magazine 1973 edition of the 25th anniversary of Israel's creation. Israel was portrayed as a miracle, as a bastion of democracy and freedom. The word Palestinian does not appear anywhere in that magazine.
That's fascinating.
Only once to refer to pre-1948 Jews in Palestine.
Right.
They were the Palestinians.
Right.
1973. It's not ancient history. What happened? It changed. The image of Israel changed. Israel, in fact, is much more democratic today, much more liberal today. We just had the largest gay pride parade in Asia last week, and in Israel that wouldn't have happened before 1967. Certainly, something changed. The image changed, and the narrative in the press changed. But this is another subject. Israel has to cope with this reality. It is very difficult. And one of the basic problems we face with the press, you're not going to believe this, is very simply ratings. Ratings. Not all journalists wake up in the morning and hate Israel and think how we're going to make Israel look bad. But Israel brings headlines. And I saw it again and again, both as an officer in the IDF dealing with the press, and then as ambassador. We would have, the Hamas would put out fake photographs of Palestinian dead. They'd take pictures from zombie movies and say these bodies were dismembered by Israeli soldiers, and mainstream American media would take them and reprint them because it got them headlines, and people aren't reading enough newspapers here. And I know some of these journalists were rather pro-Israel, but they needed to make a living. We have to deal with that reality, and then one of the jobs I have in Knesset is deepening this awareness within Israel that we can't afford to ignore this threat, because it's not a PR problem, Dennis. It's a strategic threat. We are up against Hamas and Hezbollah. They know they can't destroy us with the rockets. They know they can't destroy us with the tunnels. How can they destroy us? They can create an international situation where we can't defend ourselves, where our planes can't take off, our tanks can't roll forward, and they can keep shooting rockets at us until we die.
That's their strategy.
It's what I call, it's a military tactic that serves a media and diplomatic strategy. And they want to get to the point where we are totally delegitimized, and then they can knock us off. They can knock us off with 100,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah.
Let me go to the personal for a moment. What was it like to be in the White House when Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama were talking to one another?
Well, strangely enough, they had a rather cordial relationship. Sometimes it was funny. Sometimes it went on for hours. I was not present in any strong disagreements. I'd heard about disagreements. There's always a part of a conversation between a president and prime minister that takes place one-on-one, or as they say in Hebrew, four eyes. All right, mm-hmm. Four-eyed conversation, which makes you wonder whether Diane had three-eyed conversations.
That's right.
But
the other one eye.
But you don't know what. And I would hear sometimes we get a briefing about or a readout what would happen behind closed doors, and sometimes that would have a different tone to it. The big disagreements were very public, whether Israel was snubbed at the White House. What I talk about in the book is the decision made by the administration. This was an accident. A decision to dispense with two of the key components in the U.S.-Israel relationship as we have known it since the middle Reagan years, certainly since the middle 80s. And these two components were no surprises and no daylight. No surprises means if the United States is going to make a major pronouncement on Middle Eastern affairs that impacts Israel's security, Israel's going to get a chance to look at that text before it does that. That's what Bush did with Arik Sharon in 2002. All right, give us the other one in a moment, because I want everybody to know the book, Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide, Michael Oren, up at my website. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here with the last ambassador of Israel to the United States, Michael Oren, O-R-E-N, and his major work, Ally, a national bestseller. The subtitle, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. He has been the ambassador through most of the Obama years, the Israeli ambassador to the United States. So I asked you, how did this happen? How did we get a divide between two countries that basically are in love, had been in love with each other?
So you would mention that there were two sort of promises made, or two
pillars of it.
Fair enough.
We always had disagreements. We had disagreements about settlements. We had disagreements about Jerusalem. Some of them went back to Lyndon Johnson. Some of them went back to Harry Truman. Harry Truman put the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem. And the non-recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital goes back to 1948. But the question is, how do we handle the divides? So we had no surprises. If America's going to make a major pronouncement on policy, Israel's going to get a chance in advance to look at it. In June 2009, President Obama went to Cairo. He didn't stop in Israel. He gave a speech that was twice as long as the first inaugural address, and it touched on many issues that impacted Israel's vital security. The Palestinian issue, but above all, he became the first president to publicly declare that Iran had the right to peaceful nuclear energy. This is an Iran that is the world's largest state sponsor of terror, and which pretty much on a weekly basis called for Israel's destruction. So these were very big pronouncements, important for us, but we never got a look at the draft before he gave the speech, so we were surprised. No daylight. Daylight means we can have our differences over Jerusalem, but we don't have them publicly. We have them behind closed doors because our enemies will see that we are divided, and our enemies will insinuate themselves between us and exploit our differences. The administration made a very purposeful decision at the outset. The first meeting between Netanyahu and Obama was in May of 2009. I was there. They've had 12 meetings, and I've been at all of them. He and the president surprised the prime minister. He said, "I demand an absolute freeze in settlement construction, both in the West Bank and in Jerusalem," which, by the way, no Israeli prime minister can do because Jerusalem is sovereign Israeli territory. An Israeli prime minister can no more freeze in Jerusalem than the president of the United States could freeze in Los Angeles. Can't do that. But not only was the demand a surprise, the demand was made very, very public. And it was put up, and the president was quoted saying, "I'm going to put daylight between Israel and the United States." It turned out to be a problem not just for Israel, it turned out to be a problem for the Palestinians, because Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas couldn't be less Palestinian than the President of the United States. So areas in which he had previously more or less conceded to the Israelis.
How interesting.
He could, the minute the President demanded a freeze in Jerusalem, Mahmoud Abbas had to demand a freeze in Jerusalem, and so the process went nowhere.
What is the reasoning behind his freeze belief? Because if Israel announces, by the way, Prime Minister Netanyahu did announce a freeze, and nothing happened.
It was a big debate. I write about it extensively. I myself was very ambivalent about it. I didn't like creating a precedent where we would pay the Palestinians to negotiate with us. I think it was a bad precedent. But it was either that or get into a head-on collision with the Obama administration. It was a tough choice for the Netanyahu government. He decided to give the Palestinians a 10-month moratorium of new building in the West Bank, not in Jerusalem. It did not include Jerusalem. It can't, again, by law. The Mahmoud Abbas didn't come to the negotiating table. He waited till 3 weeks before the moratorium expired, and then his demand was to extend the moratorium.
What does Abbas want?
Abbas wants Israel to go. I mean, it's a tactical decision whether in the first stage there'll be a Palestinian state living side by side. I think he's abandoned this now. I think he's learned from the international community that he can get the Palestinian state without paying a price. Mm-hmm. If you're in negotiations, you got to pay a price. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you something, I'm going to give something back. If he's going to have a Palestinian state, he's going to have to recognize Israel as the Jewish state, that we actually have an historic legitimacy to be there. He has to give us security. He has to give us defensible borders. But if he goes to the UN and gets a Palestinian state without having to give us anything, why would he negotiate?
Would Barack Obama acknowledge that if there were, let's say Israel unilaterally withdrew tomorrow, okay, you know what, we're sick of all of this, bye-bye, we're leaving the West Bank. Mm-hmm. And would in his view that mean a demilitarized Palestinian state, or he would even allow it to have its own army and porous borders?
Well, theoretically we're talking about a demilitarized Palestinian state that would have sort of a police force.
When you say we, you mean the Israelis.
And the United States. And
that is understood.
That was understood, but the big question was, who was going to guard the border with Jordan?
Yes, that's right.
It's no small question.
Right.
We pulled out of Gaza in 2005. We pulled out of southern Lebanon in 2000. Our problem with Gaza wasn't our border, it was the Egyptian border and all the tunnels. That's where the rockets came from. Our problem with southern Lebanon wasn't our border with southern Lebanon, it was Syria's border with southern Lebanon. So our problem with the Palestinian state, should it ever come into being, wasn't going to be our border, it was going to be Jordan's border, Syrian border. Who's going to guard that border?
And what is the answer to that?
So, well, in the past, they brought an international force into Lebanon. Guess what?
Oh, please.
So you got it.
Oh, it's painful. I'm choking.
So under the watchful eye of
UN
UN
the international
forces,
force that allowed genocide in Burundi?
Yeah, in Lebanon, the under the auspices of the UN, an international force, Hezbollah went from having an arsenal of 12,000 rockets to having an arsenal of 100,000 rockets. So we can't afford that in the West Bank. Imagine 100,000.
So wait, it is understood that a demilitarized Palestinian state would not include Israel patrolling the eastern border?
That's what Mahmoud Abbas wants. He doesn't want Israeli forces there.
Well then, so why doesn't Israel make, not that it would matter perhaps, but why doesn't Israel make that clear?
We do, and we say it's going to be there for a long time. Our margin for error here is exactly zero. Is zero. We won't be within rocket range, we'll be within rifle range of the West Bank. And no one's going to take that type of gamble. And the crazy thing is, Dennis, that Mahmoud Abbas knows that without the IDF there, he's a dead man. And that's the irony.
Story you told earlier, my question is, why wasn't that reported? Israel saved Abbas's life against Hamas and it wasn't reported.
It wasn't. It doesn't report it here.
Yes.
We arrested hundreds of Hamas operatives.
Yeah, okay.
Who are going to kill him.
The book is Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. Ambassador Michael Oren. I'm Dennis Prager. We continue. The worst part about an hour like this is that it comes to an end, because I could have a 3-hour interview with this man. Because he's not only the man who is at the vortex of American-Israeli relations as the Israeli ambassador of the United States in the bulk of the Obama era, but he's a historian before that. His book on the Six-Day War is a classic, for example. So it's just a joy, even though the topic is not filled with joy, I must say. Could you have a joyful interviewee, but the topic be not joyful? It's just philosophical silliness, but in any event. One final, there's so much to talk about, but do you believe that John Kerry and Barack Obama have I'm sorry to put it this way, a tin ear with regard to Israel's existential issue with Iran?
I believe that there are two fundamental differences between Israel and the Obama administration on Iran. And remember, Obama came out of the gate in 2009 and said, I'm going to reconcile with Iran. His senior advisor, David Axelrod, just got interviewed and said the president was thinking about this agreement with Iran from day one. So, and I more or less understood that when I assumed my post early in 2009. So the two major differences. One is purely structural. I'm going to say something borderline silly. America's a big country. It's far away from the Middle East. Americans are not threatened with national annihilation yet by the Iranians, and you have the biggest military capabilities in the world. We are a tiny nation in Israel. We are situated in Iran's backyard. They are threatening us with genocide. They're threatening to kill 8 million Israelis. And the IDF is a powerful army, but we don't have B-2 bombers. We do not have aircraft carriers. So again, our margin for error here is exactly zero. But beyond that, there are ideological and conceptual differences. The president has gone on record. He thinks the Iranian regime is rational. It's anti-Semitic, but it's rational. Operates on a cost-benefit analysis. It can be a responsible regional power. It can actually work to resolve the Shiite-Sunni divide. Talk about divides. Israel, we think they're irrational. We think they're a medieval jihadist state.
You reinforce my belief that the left lives in a make-believe world. That's what John Lennon's Imagine. That's the anthem. Michael Oren, in 10 seconds, did the Prime Minister of Israel make a mistake in coming and accepting the invitation to speak to Congress?
I think it's too early to tell. Well, it's like the French Revolution. Let's look back on history. Okay. What he was absolutely right about, Dennis, was what he said.
No
and
kidding.
That this is a bad deal, and the alternative to a bad deal is not war. The alternative to a bad deal is a good deal.
I'll see you in Israel in my next trip, sir. Michael Oren. The book is Ally. Thank you, sir, for your service to Israel and indeed to world peace. I'm Dennis Prager.